Good day. Today is Tuesday, 14th April 2026. And before I start this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this platform. If once you've watched this program, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Now, over the last 24 hours, we have begun to get a sense of a certain degree of retreat on the part of the President of the United States and his officials in the conflict that they are now locked into against Iran. Yesterday, there was talk about air and missile strikes against Iranian ports. There's been no sign of anything like that happening for the moment. There was a lot of talk yesterday about the Israeli army, in particular the Israeli military, being prepared for further military action. But for the moment, as of the last 24 hours, there have been no such attacks on Iran. The fragile truce in that respect is still holding. And there's also been reports, which this time may be true, that the Saudi government, which is widely believed and widely reported, almost certainly correctly, to have privately urged the United States in December, January and February to launch its attack on Iran, even as the Saudis publicly were warning against that attack. Anyway, the latest reports say that the Saudis have come back to the United States, to the president, and are urging him to cancel his blockade against the Iranian ports and the Iranian ships, which the same blockade that the President of the United States declared 2 days ago after the failure of the talks in Islamabad. And, well, one can understand this time the Saudi motivations. The Saudis must realize that if there was a blockade, an actual blockade on Iran, Iran would almost certainly take counter-action. The Saudis must be very worried about what the Houthis might do and about how the Houthis might block shipping through the Red Sea, shipping which of course carries what oil Iran is still in Saudi Arabia rather, is still in a position to export. So the Saudis must be worried about that. They must be worried about a further escalation, about potential attacks on their oil installations and their energy installations, and perhaps conceivably eventually on their desalination plants. And anyway, one way or the other, I get the sense that the Saudis have now revisited their thinking about this war and are trying to find a way to end the war, to return as far as possible to the status quo which existed before the start of the war on the 28th of February. Bear in mind that just a few days ago, the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers actually exchanged discussions. They actually had a conversation with each other. The first actual diplomatic contact that I am aware of between Saudi Arabia and Iran since the start of the conflict. And, well, you can see other signs that the United States might be engaged in something of a retreat. The President of the United States took down the utterly disastrous image on his Truth Social account of himself as some kind of divine or semi-divine healer. Clearly, there's been a great deal of embarrassment over this preposterous and frankly ugly image that the president projected of himself. I noticed that even some of the commentators on the thread of the president's own Truth Social post were expressing themselves in strong language about this image, demanding that it be taken down. And, well, there's even been reports that the United States and Iran might actually resume the discussions perhaps next week, that there might be a second round of the talks in Islamabad. And perhaps most important of all, there are confirmed reports that despite the so-called blockade being allegedly in operation as of yesterday, ships linked to Iran have actually been exiting the Strait of Hormuz and have been entering the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States, up to this time, has taken no action against them. Now, if, of course, this continues, then at some point the conclusion will have to be reached that this declared blockade, this declared sea blockade, announced in such categorical language by the president and confirmed by the US military, that this entire blockade is in reality an unenforceable sham. Unenforceable because the United States lacks the warships to make it effective. I've seen one report which says that the United States only has between 6 and 11 warships in the area, and that even the helicopter carriers, their helicopters do not have the necessary sweep and range to fully block the Strait of Hormuz, just say. But also, and this I will come to shortly, there may very well be concerns in the United States about retaliation by the Iranians, obviously, closing the Red Sea via the Houthis, conducting strikes against energy facilities across the Middle East, that sort of thing. But possible retaliation by third powers, most emphatically and specifically China. Now, that then brings me to perhaps the most dramatic events of the last 24 hours, events which, as far as I know, are going almost entirely unreported in the Western media, because there has been an enormous uptick in diplomatic activity. Only this diplomatic activity does not directly involve the United States or the Western powers. On the contrary, the United States and the Western powers are bystanders to it. It's all taking place without them, but it is certainly happening, and it is happening intensively. Now, the primary actors in this diplomatic activity are the BRICS powers, the two big BRICS powers, China and Russia. And let's first of all start with the Russians. Yesterday, on the eve of his trip to Beijing, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov engaged in a succession of telephone calls. The first was with none other than Abbas Araghchi, the Foreign Minister of Iran. And the Russians have provided us with a very detailed readout of this call. They say that Araghchi informed Lavrov on the details of the Iran-US talks held in Islamabad on April 11th. The Russian side welcomed the continued commitment to pursuing diplomatic efforts and seeking solutions that would address the root causes of this conflict. I will return to those words in a moment. And achieve long-term stabilization in the region, taking into account the legitimate interests of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its neighbors. Sergei Lavrov stressed the importance of preventing a relapse into armed confrontation and reaffirmed Russia's consistent readiness to facilitate a settlement of the crisis, which has no military solution. He also recalled Russia's initiative to develop the collective security concept for the Persian Gulf, involving all littoral states and supported by extra-regional countries capable of making a constructive contribution to the negotiating process. The Russian foreign minister also expressed his sincere condolences to Abbas Araghchi over the brutal killing as a result of an airstrike of the former Iranian foreign minister, chair of the Strategic Council on Foreign Relations of Iran, Kamal Kharrazi. I discussed the attack on Kharrazi's residence several programs ago. I mentioned the fact that it seemed that Kharrazi had acted as the first point of call in Iran of the Pakistani mediators, that it was through Kharrazi, who, to be clear, is retired. He was not a member, was retired. He was not a member, an official member of the Iranian government. He was a member of a think tank and gave advice to the former supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, but he was not, formally speaking, an official of the Iranian government any longer. But anyway, he was an intermediary between the Pakistanis and the Iranian government, and that apparently was enough for someone to attack his residence, an airstrike that killed his wife, which severely injured him, and now the Iranians have confirmed that he's actually dead. But anyway, let's not dwell on that killing, which in a previous program I have described as an act of murder. Let us go back to the points that the Russians are making, because of course we have this is a Russian account of this conversation that the Russians are making in this readout. So we see that the Russians say that the diplomatic efforts that have been underway should address the root causes of the conflict. Now that is language that the Americans especially by now must be very familiar with. The Russians, of course, when they talk about the conflict in Ukraine, they repeatedly say that the resolution to the conflict in Ukraine must address and solve the root causes of that conflict. The Russians, whenever they refer to the Ukrainian conflict, always say that a diplomatic resolution of the Ukrainian conflict must refer to the root causes of the conflict: NATO eastward expansion, the shift in Ukraine from neutral status, the constitutional crisis in Ukraine since what the Russians refer to as the Maidan coup of 2014, the suppression of the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, the suppression of the rights of the Russian Orthodox Church, the rise of extreme nationalist ideologies and armed groups in Ukraine. all of those things. All of these matters have to be addressed in order for there to be a resolution of the crisis in Ukraine. And the Russians are now using exactly the same language about the Iranian crisis as well. They are talking about root causes, and they are saying that the crisis around Iran can only be addressed by addressing its root causes. And that must be done by taking into account the legitimate interests of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its neighbours. Legitimate interests, of course, include security, the right of Iran to develop its society and to be left in peace and not to be subject to violent external aggression, as it has been over the period since the 28th of February, and also Iran's legitimate interests, including its rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to undertake nuclear enrichment for civilian purposes, uranium enrichment for civilian purposes. Iran, by contrast, is not or should not pursue illegitimate interests or purposes, such as seeking to develop a nuclear weapon. And then Lavrov speaks about the importance of maintaining the current ceasefire. There should be no return to fighting. And this is perhaps the most interesting part, because he then refloats what is in fact a long-standing Russian proposal, that there should be a new security architecture created for the Persian Gulf, which should involve the collective security, or the Gulf states and Iran, though potentially this could be supported by extra-regional countries capable of making a constructive contribution to the negotiation process. Countries, in other words, that are acceptable to Iran and which have facilitated the return to peace. And, well, one can list some countries which might fulfill that criteria: Russia, China, Pakistan, Turkey. Who's to say which others? But note that they must have facilitated a constructive part in the negotiations, and that for the time being appears to exclude the United States, which, of course, from a Russian perspective, is the aggressor. And, well, it certainly excludes Israel too, which has been obsessively hostile towards Iran, and which many, including, I am sure, the Russians, believe are the prime instigators of this latest conflict. So that appears to be the Russian idea: an agreement, a peace negotiated and agreed by the Persian Gulf states and the Iranians, guaranteed by the Chinese and the Russians and perhaps the Pakistanis and the Turks. Just saying. And, well, that was the call that Lavrov had yesterday on the eve of his trip to China. But then Lavrov had two other calls directly after the conversation with Arakshi. The first was to the foreign minister of the UAE, Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan. That conversation took place apparently early this morning, and the Russian readout in part reads, the parties exchanged views on the development in the Persian Gulf following the US-Iran talks in Islamabad and supported the immediate and permanent cessation of all hostilities, accompanied by further political and diplomatic efforts to overcome the crisis resulting from the unprovoked aggression against Iran by the United States and Israel. Now, I am sure that the Emirati foreign minister did not speak about the unprovoked aggression against Iran by the United States and Israel, but Lavrov, obviously, over the course of this conversation, was careful to remind Al-Nahyan of it. Now, what is interesting is about this call is that it takes place just at about the time when Lavrov must have been boarding his flight to Beijing. So at that time, Lavrov was speaking to the foreign minister of the UAE, and someone else, none other, in fact, than President Xi Jinping of China, was at that very same time speaking to the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, one of the key states within the UAE, Sheikh Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. And it's widely accepted that the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi is the most important official in the UAE. Anyway, the Chinese have produced an extremely lengthy readout of this meeting between Xi Jinping and the Crown Prince. I'm not going to read it all. All I will say is that it's very much in line with what Lavrov said to the Emirati foreign minister, and over the course of it, we read the presidency made 4 propositions on safeguarding and promoting peace and stability in the Middle East. First, stay committed to the principle of peaceful coexistence. The Gulf states are close neighbours and cannot move away. It's important to support Gulf states in improving their ties and consolidating the foundation for peaceful coexistence. Second, stay committed to the principle of national sovereignty. Sovereignty serves as a foundation for all states and must not be violated. Third, stay committed to the principle of international law. We should safeguard the authority of international law, reject selective application, and prevent the world from returning to the law of the jungle. And that also, according to Xi, involves placing further emphasis on the UN and the UN Charter. And fourth, staying committed to a balanced approach to development and security. Security is a prerequisite for development, and development serves as a safeguard of security. All sides should work to create a sound environment for and bring positive energy to the development of the Gulf states. China stands ready to share with the Gulf states the opportunities through Chinese modernization and to work with them to nurture a fertile ground for regional development and security. If that sounds rather like Lavrov's proposal that the Gulf states, Iran and the Arab Persian Gulf states all come together, work out a security architecture with each other, one underpinned and guaranteed by the Chinese and the Russians? Well, it should, because as far as I can see, it is the same. And bear in mind that the UAE, amongst the various Gulf states, apart from Bahrain, which is a special case, the UAE has reputedly been the most hostile to Iran. And here we see the Russians and the Chinese, Lavrov and Xi, working respectively, the foreign minister of the UAE and, in the case of Xi, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, the most powerful official within the UAE. Now, if you think that this is coincidence, if you believe that the Russians and the Chinese, immediately before a summit meeting of their foreign ministers, each entirely independently of each other, took it upon themselves to call senior officials, these two senior officials in the UAE, and to make to them what is in effect the same proposal. Well, if you believe that, then that is your choice. But in that case, I have, as I often say, a bridge to sell you. And, well, Lavrov also, apparently, before getting on his plane to Beijing, he spoke to someone else. And that someone else was none other than the Foreign Minister of Turkey. And this is a short readout. The two ministers discussed ways to resolve the crisis triggered by the unprovoked attack by the United States and Israel on Iran. This time, the Turks will have agreed with Lavrov's description of the attack on Iran. Moscow and Ankara expressed their readiness to support efforts towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict. They also, by the way, discussed Ukraine, but in very boilerplate fashion. I'm going to skip that part of the readout. What happens again is that the Russians, having spoken to the UAE and to the Iranians, and having floated this idea again of a joint security architecture agreed by the Persian Gulf states and the Iranians, and backed by the Chinese, the Russians, the Pakistanis, and the Turks. Anyway, the Russians and the Chinese, having discussed this with the Iranians and with the Emiratis, Lavrov calls another party that might become involved in this arrangement. He calls Foreign Minister Fidan of Turkey, and we could see that the Turks told him, we're in. We're absolutely in with this, obviously, provided it can happen. So Lavrov is now flying to Beijing. He's going to meet Wang Yi. I think there's a reasonable chance, a strong possibility, that he might meet Xi Jinping as well, though that is not certain. But you could see what is happening. The Americans, J.D. Vance, Witkoff and Kushner, met with the Iranians in Islamabad. It went nowhere. There are reports in the Financial Times today that the US demanded a freeze on uranium enrichment for 20 years. The Iranians immediately rejected that proposal. They said that they might be prepared to freeze enrichment for 5 years, but absolutely not for 20 years. And on that point, on that issue, the talks immediately broke down. So for the moment at least, it looks like the negotiations are stuck. But even as that is happening, the Chinese and the Russians are coordinating. They are busy. They've each worked on the UAE, telling the UAE, look, the Americans aren't able to deliver peace here. They aren't able to deliver security here. You are experiencing a profound, even existential crisis for you as a result of American actions. The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, of the blockade of Iran that the Americans have announced is only going to make what is already for you a critically bad situation even worse. We, however, are making positive proposals. We're telling you to get in touch, to agree with the Iranians a security architecture in which all of you will take the security of your region into your own hands, no longer relying or depending on the Americans. And we are prepared, we, the Chinese and the Russians, are prepared to underwrite it. So, Lavrov is going to arrive in China, and well, we're going to see what the Chinese and the Russians from that point going forward are going to do. Whether the Chinese are going to continue to work with the Pakistanis, use the Pakistanis to some extent at least as their front for undertaking mediation processes, though it's important to stress that Pakistan is a powerful and big country and they do have agency and they're not acting simply because the Chinese want them to in this matter. They're also acting in their own interests as well. But it'll be interesting to see whether the Chinese are prepared to move from the shadows and are prepared to take a more active role now in the diplomacy. And the events of the last 24 hours strongly suggest that they are. Now, in the meantime, the Chinese have made various threats of their own. They have strenuously denied the American claims that Chinese ships are delivering weapons to Iran. They said that this is simply not true. They say that if the United States acts on Donald Trump's threat to impose 50% tariffs on China because of this, then China will not hesitate to take retaliatory action. And we have no difficulty guessing what that's going to be. The Chinese are going to put retaliatory tariffs of their own, and they will stop exports of rare earths. And not just rare earths, but other critical materials as well, tungsten, whatever. So the Chinese have reminded the US that alongside the velvet glove, there is also a mailed fist. They deployed it actively last year during the trade war, and that mailed fist is still and continues still to be there. So I come back to the negotiations between the United States and Iran. I'm going to suggest that this sea blockade is a ridiculous idea. It is also, and this is an important and essential point to say, it is also an admission that the United States is out of military options, that the missile strikes on Iran were unsuccessful, They did not collapse the regime there. I repeatedly said before the conflict began that since the attack on Iran on the 28th of February was an attempt to achieve regime change, anything less than regime change would be a failure. And if the Iranian political system came through the crisis intact, it would have achieved a significant victory. Well, so it has turned out. There have been various attempts to try to argue that the American objective is less than regime change. In fact, that is no longer talked about anymore, which is already a confession of failure. The Americans instead are talking about degrading Iran's arsenal, placing restrictions on its ballistic missiles, stopping uranium enrichment, and all of that. But the fact is that they have no ability using kinetic force to enforce those demands, to oblige the Iranians to capitulate and to accept those demands. And with the Iranians maintaining their tight control of the Strait of Hormuz, a prolongation of the crisis only works diplomatically and politically to the advantage of the Iranians and to the disadvantage of the United States and of the collective West, since Iran has far more ability to endure the economic pressure than the United States and the West all do. Over the last couple of days, there's been more and more articles acknowledging this fact. There is an article today in the Financial Times, for example, which comes with the title, "Why Time Favors Iran." So, the United States, out of military options, desperately looking for some way to intensify pressure on Iran, has declared the sea blockade. The sea blockade, as of the time of making of this program, is not being enforced and does not appear to be effective. And in any event, it does not resolve the underlying problem, which is that the Iranians continue to prevent, or rather continue to take steps which prevent, unrestricted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, with the massive problems in the global economy which that is causing. So, we come back to the fundamental problem. If military action cannot work, and note again that in the readout of the call between Lavrov and Arakci, the Russians are careful to say that there is no military solution to this conflict, and that is clearly addressed first and foremost to the Americans. In the absence of a military solution, in the absence of any method of achieving victory, there is only a return to negotiations left. And of course, that will mean the United States making significant concessions, certainly on the topic of nuclear enrichment, of uranium enrichment by Iran. But the alternative is not just a prolongation of Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz and a growing economic crisis in the West, but what is the emerging, very real possibility that the crisis will eventually be solved, not through American diplomacy, but by the diplomacy of China and Russia, which will in effect mean the end of American influence, direct American influence in this part of the Middle East. If the Chinese and the Russians, perhaps especially the Chinese, replace the United States as the guarantor of security and stability in the Middle East, the role of the United States will have gone. We will see all those American bases sooner or later close. The Persian Gulf states themselves won't want them to remain. China will replace the United States as the dominant actor in this part of the Middle East, and potentially one day in all of it. Now, I personally would not have any great concerns about such an outcome. It seems to me that the Chinese would have as much interest in maintaining a steady flow of oil and other exports from the Middle East. I cannot imagine that the Chinese would want to leverage any position of influence that they achieved in this area to achieve some kind of difficult to imagine geopolitical objective. But I am assuming that this is not an outcome which in the United States they want to see. So if that is so, I would strongly suggest to them that they do contact the Pakistanis, that they do send negotiators again to Islamabad. I see no reason why the negotiations should not again be conducted by J.D. Vance, but I think that the sooner Witkoff and Kushner depart the scene, the better it will be. And then the United States should conduct negotiations on a realistic basis, which will be embarrassing, to put it mildly, and will involve significant concessions to Iran, but which might, at least possibly, preserve some level of influence for the United States in this part of the Middle East. That, it seems to me, is the obvious, logical, and correct course for the Americans to take. Whether they will do so remains to be seen. In the meantime, they should also do that which I have repeatedly been saying ever since the conflict began on the 28th of February, they should also do, which is speak to the Chinese and the Russians. They should do it without use of peremptory language, without threats and ultimatums. In fact, they should be moving away from the whole policy of sanctions and economic pressure, which has been so altogether disastrous. And they should try to work with the Chinese and the Russians rather than against them, because ultimately it is in the US interest to have a peaceful Middle East. Again, I don't expect the Americans assuming anybody from the administration is even listening to this program, I don't accept the Americans to follow that advice. Anyway, there we are. That is where we are. The blockade is failing. If it succeeds, if shipping from Iran is indeed blocked, then it will be an even bigger disaster, resulting in an even higher oil price. Perhaps the United States lacks the resources on the ground to enforce this blockade, and perhaps, given what enforcing the blockade might do to the price of energy, the United States doesn't seriously even want to. If the second is the case, then of course it should not have announced this blockade at all, and it should simply drop this whole idea. Now, the last point I want to make is that, of course, the United States is utterly wrong in treating the failure of the meeting in Islamabad on Sunday as the failure of the entire diplomatic process, given the mistrust between both sides, given the history of broken promises and assassinations and violent actions by the United States against Iran. To imagine that the Iranians would simply sit by and agree to whatever it was that the Americans were proposing was ridiculous. And regardless of that, inevitably, a conflict of this kind is going to take many rounds of negotiations, detailed negotiations, to sort out. The fact that the US no longer seems to understand that they seem to think that you can solve a complicated problem like this over the course of a single meeting, again shows how juvenile understanding of diplomacy has by now become in Washington. Anyway, there it is. Now, there is something further which I do want to say, which is about China, which is that there is a very powerful narrative that this whole conflict ultimately is about China, that the entire purpose of the military attack against Iran is to deprive China of oil, that this is going to deepen the crisis in China, or at least that is the intention, and that the US intends that way to secure and extend its hegemony in the world. Now, Glenn Greenwald, the US journalist and commentator, who, by the way, nowadays lives in Brazil, anyway, he or people on his website have pointed out that there has been no statement or comment by any US official that actually sets out such an objective. But for my part, I think there probably is something to it. I think that, as I've said in the past, whenever you try to understand US foreign policy, there is always a key to whatever question you have, which is China. How does whatever the US is doing, how does it impact China? So I think that there is something to this. But having said that, if this is the US plan, then the US needs to understand that it is failing. China is mostly energy self-sufficient. It has a very reliable oil and gas supplier, which is Russia. which can meet all of its remaining needs, even if it becomes the only fossil fuel provider to China. The Chinese can withstand this siege. The Americans cannot. The Americans have depleted their energy reserves. They're more dependent on fossil fuels, much more dependent on fossil fuels than the Chinese are. This policy, if its objective is to weaken the Chinese, it's not going to weaken the Chinese. It is going to strengthen the Chinese. We see that in this diplomatic action, where the Chinese are now working with the Russians to broker a peace settlement in the Persian Gulf without the United States. And instead of weakening the Chinese, who is actually being weakened? Why, of course, the Americans and their allies. They've further depleted their already severely depleted arsenals. They've exposed again the problems in their military industrial system. They've failed to bend Iran to their will, and through their actions they've lost control of the Strait of Hormuz to Iran, and in the process they've precipitated a global economic crisis which will mostly affect themselves and their friends. If this policy is indeed all about China, then it is a bad policy. It's a bad policy at every level. But at a practical level, it is also a bad policy, and one which should be immediately abandoned. Just saying. Well, what will the US do? Will there be negotiations with Iran next week? I don't know. I'm guessing perhaps that there will. I doubt that the Americans are yet ready to make any substantial concessions. Personally, I don't expect such concessions to come from the Americans until it becomes clear, unavoidably clear, that we're going to be in a major economic crisis. And that will probably not be the case before the summer. But anyway, I always say the best thing to do in analysing and discussing events of this kind is to think through the consequences and to discuss the options. And negotiating with the Iranians now and coming to an agreement with the Iranians now, even if it involves concessions, is certainly and indisputably the best option. Anyway, there it is. That is what I'm going to say about the situation in the Middle East and in Iran at the present time. Now, the conflict in Ukraine, meantime, goes on. And here we continue to get more news. And, well, there's been more Geran strikes by the Russians over the last 24 hours. And we've had significant demonstrations over the last 24 hours of the growing sophistication of the Gerans. There's video footage which shows Gerans being redirected from their targets towards fresh targets. Apparently, over the course of one Geran strike, the Russians identified the presence of a Ukrainian anti-drone battery, or the Gerans were redirected to attack it, and they did. And it looks as if the Girans were acting at all times under the control of a ground controller, probably operating deep within Russia. And we have had further news that the Russians are now significantly increasing their control in Sumy region. There's been further Russian advances there. I think that it is not an overstatement to say that the Ukrainians are starting to panic about the situation in Sumy region. The Russians have entered the big forest immediately to the north of the city of Sumy. Doing that provides their men with cover from Ukrainian drones, enabling the Russians to begin operations from this forest against the city of Sumy itself. I'm going to make a guess that before very long, the Ukrainians, who are short of men, and by the way of drone operators, are going to have to redirect resources away from Zaporozhye region specifically to try to stem the Russian advance towards the city of Sumy, which is clearly intended eventually to lead to a Russian capture of that city. I think by now that is becoming increasingly clear, positioning the Russians to make moves against Ukraine's two biggest cities, Kharkiv and the capital, Kiev itself. And Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, the newspaper with a strong national, patriotic, political orientation, but one which is also, from what I can see, very closely connected to the Russian military. They are now publishing further information about the situation in the city of Konstantinovka in Donbass, and they clearly believe that the battle for Konstantinovka is indeed now coming to an end, that the Russians have captured the main positions, Ukrainian positions in Konstantinovka, and that the battle for Konstantinovka is taking its inevitable course. So that is all going on, and there are all sorts of other things happening on the battlefronts. But in this program, I'm going to discuss two other issues, both Ukrainian war related. Now, a few weeks ago, over the course of the Christmas, New Year holidays, I did several programs about the legal action that the Russians were likely to take against the European Union in connection with the freezing of the Russian central bank's assets. I said that, to my knowledge, several cases had been brought or were in the process of preparation, that it looked debatable whether there were any remaining defences to these cases, especially given the battle within the EU over the attempted confiscation, outright seizure, theft, if you prefer, of these assets, which further exposed the legal doubts about these moves this move. Personally, I should stress again, I have no doubt I consider the original freezing order and any plans to seize the assets to be illegal, and I've explained in many programs why. But anyway, I said that it looked as if the Russians were preparing a claim, that claim was likely to be brought in various courts. The Russians had already brought a claim in their own domestic courts. It looks as if they're going to use arbitration procedures to start legal action against various member states outside the EU jurisdiction. But it was only a matter of time before they also took legal action in the main European courts themselves, specifically in the European Court of Justice. And yesterday, confirmation came that that has indeed happened. And interestingly, it happened on the 27th of February, but has only been announced now. And I'm taking this from the Russian news agency TASS. The Central Bank of Russia disputed the freeze of Russian assets and charged the EU Council. The EU Council is the most senior decision and policy-making body within the EU system, and charged the EU Council with infringement on division of powers, violations of EU law and procedure, and decision-making in absence of required competencies. I presume the latter means that the EU Council acted outside its jurisdiction. And TASS then goes on to say, such wordings are contained in the statement of claim registered by the EU Court of Justice on February 27th. And then we have a direct quote from the statement of claim. The applicant argues that the regulation was adopted on an incorrect basis, and then relevant statutes are cited, that it cannot constitute a valid basis for the measures adopted since substantively they fall within the scope of restrictive measures against an entity of a third state and should have been based on an entirely separate EU law which requires unanimity of the member states. The use of Article 122 therefore constitutes a flagrant circumvention of the specific institutional framework provided by the treaties for the purpose of adopting such measures in infringement of the division of powers and the institutional balance. The Bank of Russia demands cancellation of the decision to freeze sovereign assets and payment of legal costs by the EU Council. Now, when we read this extract from the Russian Central Bank's statement of claim, it becomes clear that what the Russians are here litigating against is not the original decision to freeze the Russian assets, which was made in February 2022, but the decision of the EU Council in December 2025 to make that asset freeze indefinite and to do so by majority vote, relying on legislation, EU legislation, which gives the EU Council the ability to take swift action by majority vote rather than unanimity at a time of economic crisis. When that proposal was made last year in December, I remember reading in the Financial Times that EU officials were telling the Financial Times that the decision was a clear violation of EU law and was in fact crazy. I think that was the actual word used. And I said at the time that it invited obvious legal challenge by the Russians. And here we are, we see that it has been brought. Now, this is going to put the European Court of Justice in an extremely difficult position. Firstly, they can implement the letter of the law. That is what EU courts of any kind, after all, are supposed to do. But of course, if they do that, they will humiliate the entire European Union. They will almost certainly create a situation where the EU president, Ursula von der Leyen, her position within the EU as EU Commission President comes under obvious legal challenge, because she was apparently one of the major advocates for this, quote, crazy idea, and a crazy and illegal idea. If the EU Court of Justice goes ahead and decides in favour of Russia, there will presumably be an order for compensation to be paid to the Russians. The statement of claim actually provides for that. I personally don't see how in any rational universe Ursula could actually survive a decision of that kind. And as I said, given the fact that we've had all of this commentary in the media at the time, back in December, about how crazy and illegal this decision was, given the stated doubts of all sorts of EU member states, including the member states who back in February 2022 voted to freeze the assets in the first place. Again, I can't help but see how this case can be successfully defended. The Russians are certain to ask for full disclosure of all documents, including probably legal advice, just saying. There'll be arguments of privilege, but I am not sure that they apply in a case like this. Anyway, I can very easily see how this is going to blow up in Ursula's face. The EU will be landed with a bill. The bill will run into billions of euros. The EU Commission will be liable. The EU Commission will have to apply for further funding to the EU states. The EU states, in the middle of a crisis, a financial crisis, especially if energy prices as a result of the Iran crisis go on rising, paying large checks to bail out the EU Commission because of a blunder committed by Ursula von der Leyen. As I said, I don't myself see how she can survive something like this. So anyway, that is one option that the European Court of Justice has. It can just simply put all that aside, follow the law, and come to that decision. Or it can do something completely different. It can throw out the Russian case, come up with some sophisticated and phony legal argument, which basically sets aside and in fact permanently changes the law to allow or to enable or to legalize, if you prefer, if that's the right word, what the EU in December did. But at that moment, or so it seems to me, the credibility of the EU as a global financial centre ends. Because any third-party country, the Gulf Arab states, the Chinese, the Asians, all of those people will say to themselves, if we put money in Europe, in European banks or European depositories like Euroclear, well, the EU courts themselves tell us that the EU can, whenever it chooses, even if there is no majority for it on the EU Council, they can simply declare an economic emergency and freeze our assets. They will disregard concepts of sovereign immunity and they will just go ahead and seize our assets. So they can do that. They can do that too. I'm not going to guess in this program which side of the offence they intend to come down on. I'm going to make a guess that they're going to spin this case out for as long as they can. But the EU court now has an incredibly difficult decision to make. One way, there is strict compliance with the law, but a political crisis and the fall of the President of the Commission, potentially. The other way, there is the destruction of the legal and financial credibility of the EU system. Now, all of that brings us to the next question. Why did the Russians announce this now? The statement of claim was filed on the 27th of February. The Russians have kept the fact quiet, but now we have an article about it in the official Russian news agency, TASS. Well, I am going to come up with my own theory, and it is purely a theory because nobody in Russia has told me. But I'm going to suggest that it is linked to the election in Hungary, to the election victory of Peter Marois and the fall of Viktor Orban. Because one of the things that Marois has been saying, and I use the words, choosing my words carefully, has been saying in the past, is that if he was elected, he would greenlight the 90 billion euro loan that the EU decided to provide to Ukraine, and which Orban managed first to get the EU to say that Hungary would not bear any of the burden of, but which Orban then subsequently, at the time of the crisis over the Druzhba pipeline, began to oppose. And the reason here is this following. If the Hungarian objection to the loan now falls away and the loan can be proceeded with, then we are presumably finally at the point where the bonds are going to have to be placed in the financial markets. Already a very difficult thing to do, by the way, at a time of massive financial stress caused by the Ukraine war. But the point is that, as I've said many times, it's very unclear how the bondholders expect to be paid, given that the original terms of the 90 billion euro loan appear to envisage, even though they never quite say, that the loan is supposed to be paid back out of reparations that the Russians pay to Ukraine. Now, the reality has always been that since the bonds would be floated by the European Commission, and the European Commission is funded by the EU member states, it would be the EU member states that would have to foot the bill if there was ever a Ukrainian default and there were never Ukrainian repayers of the bonds. But now there is a complication, because any person within the global investment community who is now thinking of buying these bonds has to contend with the fact that the Russians have brought a case against the EU Commission, and if the case is successful, that will affect the EU Commission's ability to redeem the bonds. Well, I am not saying that this in and of itself and by itself is going to prevent investors, international investors, from buying the bonds. But it is likely that they will demand an even higher premium than the very, very high premium they're going to insist on anyway, especially in a situation of financial crisis. So anyway, this is a discussion of this particular case. There are other cases coming. The Russians have a case of their own in their own domestic courts. We've not heard very much about it, but probably we will get a decision fairly soon. They have now brought this case to the European Court of Justice. We'll see what the European Court of Justice does. One option might be to simply reject the suit entirely and bury it. But again, that would be highly problematic in a legal sense, and it comes with those questions of credibility that I have already discussed. But there are other cases coming too. There are cases that are going to be brought in various arbitration courts around the world. And, well, this whole business from now on is going to become legally extremely interesting. Now, when I spoke about Marouard, I said that he has previously given the impression that if elected, he would greenlight the 90 billion euro loan. I now notice that directly following his election, it seems to be walking this back to some degree. He continues to give the impression that, well, certainly Hungary will have no part in this loan, but that he doesn't think that the loan, the 90 billion euro loan, is anyway a good idea. Could it be that he now has heard, now that he's been elected, he has learnt about this Russian case and has been advised that appearing to support this loan actually comes with political and potentially even legal risks. Well, this has been a rather heavy piece of legal analysis, but I was wondering when this would come. I was sure that it would come, and of course it has. I'm going to say something else. Yesterday I discussed in my program how Kirill Budanov was saying that Ukraine stood on the brink of disaster. I wondered whether that disaster was the situation in Konstantinovka, where, as I said, Ukrainian resistance appears to be collapsing. Given the extraordinary fiscal crisis that might happen if the 90 billion euro loan is cancelled or can't be implemented, or if there are problems with it in the financial markets, I wonder whether the Ukrainians have now also been given advice about this Russian case and have now been told that there is a possibility, maybe not a great one, that the money from the loan will never be paid over to Ukraine at all. Given the extraordinary financial straits that Ukraine is in, that would indeed be a disaster. It would finally be the moment, I suspect, when we would see not just inflation in Ukraine, we've seen plenty of that over the last 10 years, but perhaps a drift towards something like hyperinflation. And the Russians, in the meantime, have been taking further steps to shut off further sources of revenue for Ukraine. They have escalated their missile strikes on Odessa, on the port of Odessa. They've attacked more ships, merchant ships in Odessa, including one which was apparently loading with a cargo of grain. An extraordinary action, by the way, for the Russians to take, given the gathering crisis of every commodity, including food, in the international markets. It's, I suspect, something that the Russians have been keen to do for a long time, but with all the focus on the Middle East, they now feel they can do it. So anyway, the Russians are choking off another source of revenue for Ukraine. There's again a question mark over the loan. And of course, on the front lines, in Konstantinovka, in Sumy region, in Zaporozhye, the Russians keep advancing. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X and Substack. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this platform. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.